That's where your middle managers have an enormous amount of knowledge and insight to bring to that, and yet they're not typically involved in those discussions. Will this strategy work? Will this be successful once we go to battle? If you haven't asked your people who are in the trenches, in the front line, you are just hoping that this will be successful. I find that analogy is the best description of why the deal strategy doesn't play out in execution, because the people who are actually executing it aren't involved in defining the strategy for it and weighing in. Do we have enough time? Is the timeline appropriate? Do we have the resources? Do we have the right people in place to execute this as this comes together? Do we have the right budget? Oftentimes, you've got two companies coming together and they're trying to create something new out of that. Do you have the right timeline, budget, and resources in order to do that?
So very excited to have Jennifer here. Jennifer, thank you so much for joining us. We are going to dive into M&A. I guess let's start with the big question, which is M&A is a process that has been around business for a very long time. Why are we still screwing it up all the time?
Good question, Ma. It's a fascinating dilemma. And I should say for our listeners, just so everyone's 100% clear, M&A is mergers and acquisitions. I've had enough people go, M&A, is that like S&M? No, it is not. Mergers and acquisitions is what I work in. And it's fascinating to me as why the statistic of 70-90% failure rate for mergers and acquisitions has endured for over 2 decades. That statistic was done, I believe, a Harvard Business Review study, and it hasn't changed. It's part of the reason why I do the work that I do. My thesis is that the people piece of mergers and acquisitions tends to be secondary in deal due diligence. And so part of my quest and mission is to help business owners, entrepreneurs, and leaders be smarter about the role that people play in M&A success.
What typically happens in that process? Because I think we often only hear in the news, ta-da, somebody has acquired some company at X billion, and wow, that's a high evaluation. And to your point, it's a long process, many decision makers, many influence. Even when, quote, it is successful, there's things behind the scene is like not as successful. So break us down a little bit. How long does it typically take? What's considered a success or not? What's the right way to even go about understanding what's a success or not?
So we'll start there. Success is, right? Because you go in with a deal thesis. There's a business case for why you would go into this deal. And the projections are based on what you will hit by year one. Post-deal, the thesis is based on here's what the business is expected to achieve within that first year. And so that failure rate is based on 70-90% of companies not hitting that forecasted valuation by year one. And there's so many variables, right? But I'm just going to focus on the people piece of this because so much of a merger or an acquisition initially is cloaked in secrecy. There's a lot of reasons for the confidentiality. But what I find, and I actually just wrote an article about this in Forbes, middle managers not being included in that deal strategy, the vision and how it's going to be executed, because middle managers are rarely involved in that early stage. To me, that's the equivalent of battlefield commander in war, not asking his people on the front lines. That's where your middle managers have an enormous amount of knowledge and insight to bring to that, and yet they're not typically involved in those discussions.
And how long does it usually take?
That can vary. Each merger or acquisition is different. What I say is you need to be prepared that it's going to take a while. So let's divide it into 3 parts. You have the pre-deal due diligence. This is where you're both checking each other out, whether you're going through a merger or an acquisition. There's that dance of, do your numbers look good? Will this work? Do we have the right leadership in place? What's the market for this when we come together? There's all that analysis that has to be done beyond just looking at the books and understanding the business. So that's the pre-deal dance.